In addition to a focus on personalized medicine, oncology care has also been experiencing a shift from volume-based to value-based reimbursement over the last several years. This focus on value has driven an increased interest in novel payment models linked to clinical pathways and other decision support as a means by which to maximize evidence-based care while minimizing ineffectiveness, inefficiency, and costly treatments. The popularity of clinical pathways has been growing. A 2012 McKinsey report estimated that by 2015, 25% of oncology lives will have been treated by clinical pathways. Now, it's not clear if that projection has been completely met, but certainly the trend in this direction is clear. Like any tool used in medical care, there are benefits and drawbacks to clinical pathways. When pathways are structured appropriately, with the needs of the provider and patient in mind, pathways can provide an opportunity to, 1, help providers better understand and access the best available evidence and care practices. Also, to limit unnecessary and potentially more harmful treatment options for a given patient, to increase efficiency in their care, and to ensure patients get optimal care. But when pathways are not designed appropriately, they can limit physician autonomy. They can create barriers to patient choice and personalized care. They can encourage the use of less effective and potentially more harmful treatment options. And if they do not keep up with the rapidly evolving research, they can impede access to innovative and potentially more beneficial treatments. So this is where the Turning the Tide initiative comes in. Through our previous work in the field of alternative payment models, we wanted to look more closely at pathways and how we could help inform their evolution in the direction that incorporated advances in science while addressing the concerns of patients and their providers. Toward the end of last year, the Turning the Tide initiative convened an expert working group with the goal of understanding how clinical pathways could sustain innovation and provide high-quality, patient-focused care. Our working group had approximately 12 members and represented stakeholders from the patient advocacy, oncology care provider, biopharmaceutical industry, health information technology, and payer communities. The working group undertook a 2-phase project designed to come to consensus around a set of best practices for clinical pathways and to assess how existing pathway programs adhered to that list, that best practices list. For the purposes of today's webinar, we are going to focus on the pathway assessment phase of the project. Our full set of best practices is detailed in our discussion paper, which can be found on the Turning the Tide website, which is listed on the URL on the bottom of this slide. If you have not already, we encourage everyone to check it out. For the assessment phase of this project, Turning the Tide partnered with the consulting firm Discern Health to go through some of the existing clinical pathway programs. So here to take us through the assessment methodology and findings is Guy D'Andrea, partner at Discern Health. So with that, let me turn it over to Guy. Guy, are you remember to unmute
I'm
yourself?
here. Thank you, Daryl. Yes, I think I'm unmuted now, and pleased to be here today to share some of our research on clinical pathways. As Daryl mentioned, Discern Health is a consulting firm. We're focused on performance measurement and value-based payment in healthcare. And we were brought into this project to work with Turning the Tide to assess how clinical pathways adhere to the consensus guidelines that the expert working group put together. So our methodology for the assessment on the next slide was to first identify a list of pathway programs of interest drawn from market research and from suggestions from the working group members. And then for each pathway, we assessed the pathway in comparison to the best practices, using information that we drew from the pathway's own websites, using other available documentation for each pathway, and then when possible, scheduling one-on-one interviews with the pathway organizations themselves. Additionally, there was some discussion about whether the pathway development, implementation, and evaluation processes differed depending on the type of cancer. So in our research plan, we identified several different types of cancer: breast cancer, lung cancer, colorectal cancer, with the intention that we would evaluate each pathway against each type of cancer to see if there were significant differences. We did find during our analysis that in the main, the pathway processes are essentially the same for any of these clinical conditions. And so the results I'm sharing with you today really span across all the various types of cancers that we evaluated. So as I mentioned, in our research approach, we identified a list of organizations that currently develop or implement oncology pathways. And then, as you can see here on the slide, we were able to, one, get information from all of them by looking at their publicly available information. And then for most of them, we were also able to conduct one-on-one interviews. We started off with a list of 8 different organizations, but did drop one because that organization, P4 and Pathware, is not really a pathway developer. They're more associated with pathway implementation, but they are here on the list. We also included NCCN in our assessment of pathways. We should be clear that NCCN is a guideline developer. They're not a pathway developer, but many of the pathway organizations use the NCCN guidelines as their source guidelines, from which they then build and customize their pathways. So we thought it was important to include them in the research and as a benchmark. So the next slide summarizes some of the overall findings that we took from our research. A full and in-depth reporting of these findings is included in the report that Daryl had mentioned. There was a link in one of the earlier slides to that report, and that link was also provided with your registration materials. But we did want to spend some time summarizing those findings on the call today. So at a macro level, one of the first findings is that the industry is in flux. Daryl mentioned that we see pathways becoming an increasing influence in healthcare delivery. So the pathway community is growing, both in size and in importance. As it grows, organizations are adding new pathways, changing pathways. Some are acquiring other organizations, or other organizations are being eliminated. So there's a lot of change in this industry. The second main finding is that pathways frequently are not transparent to external stakeholders. Pathway developers generally regard the pathways as proprietary, and as such, much of the information about the development, implementation, and how the pathways actually influence patient care, which treatments are on pathway versus off pathway, are only available to their customers or to the end users. There's no public repository where that information is available. And frequently, other issues like governance are not transparent, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We mentioned earlier that pathways are used to serve multiple purposes. They can be used to support decision-making in the healthcare process, to make sure that physicians are aware of the various options and which of those treatment options are supported by evidence-based care guidelines. They are also used as a prior authorization tool to determine which treatments would be covered under third-party insurance. And they're also used to steer, in a health plan setting, used to steer decisions towards high-value treatments. It's important, I think, to observe that pathways really are meaningful only in the context of their implementation, right? So a pathway might specify for a given condition and for a given patient what the evidence-based care guidelines would say, but then those guidelines are put into a context and are implemented, for example, by a health plan, which might then attach financial incentives or other incentives to the use of that pathway. They might use it as a prior authorization tool. So the same pathway may be used differently by different customers and in different contexts. And therefore, when we think about the impact of pathways, we have to really think about that whole spectrum, both the development side and the implementation side. That speaks to the next bullet point, that pathways can be customizable because they're serving different purposes. They might be used by different customers in different ways. And then the final finding is that foundationally, most guidelines are drawing from similar sources of evidence, often the NCCN guidelines, and then are modified to fit specific goals and, as I mentioned, specific implementation procedures. So the next slide then summarizes some of the other key takeaways from our research. As I mentioned already, transparency is really variable from one pathway to another, especially regarding the development. So what's the governance process? Who are the decision makers for development? How often or how the pathway might be modified is often hard to tell from public sources. It's not always clear how pathways weigh specific criteria, such as cost, when determining the pathway recommendations and which pathways are considered on pathway versus off pathway. And again, whatever the pathway might say initially, some of these specific factors in the pathway might be modified or decided by the health plan or other sponsoring entity that is actually implementing the pathway. So transparency in terms of both governance and implementation can be a challenge. Generally, the next finding, pathways are all supported by evidence, usually drawing from highly respected and widely used source guidelines. But the specific evidence used to support pathways or the preference or selection of one treatment over another may not be as clear. The next finding, when looking at across pathway developers, slightly different pathways may be used for the same condition or developed for the same condition as the pathways are modified to address their use by health insurers or payers and their programs, their value criteria. So the same pathway for the same condition might be implemented slightly differently by different payers. And that makes that leads to the next finding, which is that pathways can be administratively complicated to track and use for providers. So a single provider who might have patients who are covered by different health plans might therefore be subject to different requirements from those health plans. The pathways might be slightly different, or the rules for the use and implementation of those pathways might be slightly different for different health plans. The financial incentives associated with the use of the pathways might be slightly different from one health plan to another. So for a single provider, they have to navigate that complexity. Also, we found that pathways are generally not well integrated into EHR systems, so that a provider who's implementing a pathway has to essentially have an additional workflow around the use of that pathway that's outside of their typical clinical information system. And that also adds administrative complexity, but might also inhibit the collection of information about the impact of pathways, and that comes up in a couple more bullet points. Another key takeaway from our research is that the patient role in pathway development and implementation is not clear, and in some cases appears to be non-existent. So, for example, when we talk about the governance process for developing pathways, it's not clear that patients are involved in that process. And then when it comes to the implementation of pathways, it's not clear that patients are always aware that their provider might be using a pathway to inform care decision-making. So we get back to the issue of transparency, and in this context, specifically thinking about the patient role and patient visibility in both the development and the implementation of pathways. And then finally, in terms of some of the key takeaways, we found that the developers, the pathway developers, generally don't regard it to be their role to monitor and evaluate the implementation or the impact of their pathways. They are more focused on making sure that the pathways are aligned with the current evidence and current care guidelines, and they see the health plan as being more responsible for monitoring the impact of that pathway in the actual delivery of care and patient outcomes. One possible explanation for this is that the pathway developers generally don't have access to the outcomes data, to the end user data that they might need to evaluate the impact of pathways. But it is a need, we think, that someone be responsible in the chain of pathway development and implementation, that someone be looking at the practical impact on patient care and patient outcomes of pathways. So that's a summary of the research that we did and our findings. So now that I've provided that overview, I'm going to hand the presentation back to Daryl to discuss how the working group contextualized these findings and what policy recommendations they developed as a result.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you very much for that terrific overview of the assessment component of this initiative. Very enlightening. Now, before we move on to discussing the conclusions and policy recommendations resulting from this assessment, I just wanted to open it up to see if there are any questions from the audience for Guy. And then we'll go over some of the recommendations, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. But if there are any questions for Guy, please use the control panel chat feature, which will be on the left or right of your screen, to present a question, and the T3 staff can read it.
Thanks, Daryl. So we do have a couple of questions that the audience has submitted while Guy was presenting. One of the questions is, what is or are the reasons why there could be a lack of transparency among pathway developers? Is there a competitive rationale for this?
So I think there is a competitive rationale for it. And I mentioned earlier that the content of the pathways is often a proprietary product. So that's I think that's one reason for maybe a lack of transparency around the specific components of the pathway. I think also there's generally pathway developers haven't seen themselves as being publicly facing entities. So I don't think that from our interviews, it wasn't really a conversation where they objected to the idea of transparency. They just never had really focused on it. So for a lot of organizations, especially organizations in Washington, D.C., that are involved with health policy development, they're used to the idea of having some external accountability. They have governance processes that are well documented. They invite external stakeholders into that process. I think as a fairly young industry and one that's more focused on the clinical side of the process, I don't think that pathway developers really have focused yet on the external accountability aspects of what they do. But that could change. especially as pathways do have an increasing impact as we see pathways being used more and more. That might lead to more necessity, might increase the necessity of having some public transparency and accountability.
Great. And then we had one other question, and this is around whether or not cost effectiveness analysis or cost has been incorporated into some of these pathways.
So that's one of the areas I mentioned where it's unclear exactly the extent to which cost effectiveness analysis is built into the pathways. From a clinical development side, it's when health plans implement the pathways in their own programs, they do use cost assessments and cost effectiveness analysis, but often that is added by the health plan. So it does vary, and again, it's one of these areas where it's not entirely clear, given the information that's currently available, exactly the extent to which those cost factors are integrated into the pathway development.
And one final question: Did we get any data that shows that real-world evidence or big data is involved in pathways?
That it's involved in pathways?
In the evaluation or elucidation of pathways?
So in the elucidation of pathways, which I take to mean the development of them, we didn't see a lot of influence of big data. We really saw more of a focus on the existing clinical guidelines, such as those from NCCN. Now, to the extent that NCCN considers the results of big data analyses in their guideline development, then that would have some follow-through impact on the pathways. On the evaluation side, we really didn't see any organized or robust evaluation programs in place. Daryl mentioned the best practices that the working group developed, and one of the themes that they looked at was the evaluation of pathways. And currently, it doesn't really appear that there are any sort of overall organized evaluation programs. Individual health plans may be evaluating the impact of pathways, but if they are, that's not information that's generally available. So closing the feedback loop on the use of pathways and on their impact for patient outcomes, I think is still a need. And big data may be one of the ways to help address that need.
Thank you, Guy. And Daryl, I think we'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you again, Guy, for taking those questions and for the overview. Now let's get into a quick discussion about the high-level conclusions that the working group drew from the discern analysis. First, payers, as we look through the conclusions, the first conclusion is that payers are looking for a way to deliver high-quality, evidence-based medicine while controlling costs. Pathways are currently viewed as tools to help payers deliver on their desire for high-value care. That's how payers are looking at it. Second, pathway developers are offering a product that is customizable to meet the needs of various insurers in their quest to provide high-value care. So you're getting these customized style clinical pathways. Third, once the pathway tools hit the point of utilization, and that's the clinic and the hospital, providers can utilize the decision support capabilities of these tools. But the trade-off is that managing so many payer-specific pathways is administratively burdensome. The more that there is to think about, the more the administration has to do, and this does pose, in many cases, a problem. Fourth, the ultimate beneficiary of the pathways, the patient, can benefit from the evidence-based nature of pathways, but really, unfortunately, their feedback or involvement is almost completely absent during the development, implementation, or evaluation of the pathway that is guiding their own treatment. So, strong conclusion, lack of payer participation in the development and implementation of these tools. Overall, the working group felt like the siloed nature of our healthcare system has led to a lack of accountability for individual pathway tools. So the group followed up with a number of recommendations. The working group's ultimate recommendation was that there needs to be a neutral third party who can serve as sort of an accreditation or oversight body with the capacity for clinical pathways. We envision this body operating similarly to the National Committee for Quality Assurance, the NCAQ, or the URAC. For cancer, there are a number of organizations that often play a similar role, namely the NCCN, ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, or the American College of Surgeons Commission on Cancer. This type of oversight body could play a number of roles as outlined on this slide, including outlining a process for how treatment regimens are assessed and selected for on-pathway inclusion, requiring patient involvement through the development, implementation, and evaluation of pathways, again, bringing the patient directly into this process, developing point-of-care tools that could help ease the administrative burden facing providers, again, trying to address that issue of, with a number of pathways, how to handle it administratively. Also, guiding the frequency of pathway updates that result from new scientific data, real-world evidence, and pathway monitoring and evaluation data. And finally, establishing a disclosure system whereby a patient is informed when a pathway is used to direct part of their treatment decision-making. As Guy mentioned, really a lacking part of this is that patients really don't even know that they're being put through a clinical pathway process, and they should be. So now I'd like to open it up for a panel discussion. Joining me for the discussion we have a terrific panel for you from the Turning the Tide Clinical Pathways Initiative as members of our working group. We would like to discuss both the Pathways Initiative and pathways in general. Our three panelist group of experts includes Patricia Goldsmith. Trish is the CEO of the patient advocacy group Cancer Care, which provides education and support services to millions of patients across the United States. Joining her is Dr. Gil Oman. Dr. Oman is a practicing oncologist and professor of internal medicine at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He also chairs the AACR's Cancer Policy Committee. And joining them is Kimberly Westrich. Kimberly is the Vice President for Health Services at the NPC, the National Pharmaceutical Council, and is an expert on pathways, healthcare decision-making, and value assessment, as well as other areas affecting access to healthcare treatments in general. So welcome, everyone. Before we open it up for audience questions, I want to start off with a few questions to get at the best practices for clinical pathways, how and why considering these best practices is critical, and some of your views on the assessment. So let me start with a question for all of you, and we'll go through and each one of you can give an answer. But from your perspective, and having been a member of the expert working group that informed the best practices, what did you find to be most revealing about the findings or the most important finding from this assessment? And let me start with Trish, and then we'll go through.
It's an important question, and so I have 4 comments. Or 4 buckets of where I find the most important or enlightening findings. And the first is something that was a common theme throughout both speakers' discussion, and that's the total lack of patient engagement. I think diverse perspectives are really important and should not be just providing guidance on treatment options, but they also have to incorporate the values and preferences of patients. Thus, the patient really needs to be at the heart of what is important in a pathway. And as we also said, there's lack of transparency because many patients are not aware that they're being treated on pathway. And certainly a survey that we conducted at Cancer Care shows that. And thus they may be treated as an average patient, not an individual patient. And I think unfortunately with the focus almost solely on drugs and biologics and often cost, the pathways can sometimes mimic approaches like step therapy or fail first, which is concerning. And then in some circumstances, pathway developers don't really have any disclosure of potential conflicts of interest. I'm not sure that treatments are always being assessed objectively before they're being placed on or off pathway, thus potentially an undue focus on just cost. And then incorporation of rigorous evidence. It's really important that the pathway be continuously updated and certainly show the standard of care by a rigorous evidence, thus ensuring that patients have access to the care that's best for them and right for them, and routinely updating them. So that's a summary of my important findings.
Thanks, Trish. Let me turn that same question over to Dr. Oman. What do you find is the most revealing component of our findings, or what do you think is the most important finding from this assessment?
Okay, thank you, Daryl, and thank you, Trish. I think the most overwhelming finding is how difficult it is to keep up with the rapid advances from innovation and advances in diagnosis, advances in therapies. The patients and their advocates read the latest news and hear the ads, and they're quite keen to have access to the most exciting, possibly effective new agents. But we have a process here that starts with publication, which is quite a long process, and then guideline updates. I'll come back to this later. I think NCCN is a very good foundation. In fact, University of Michigan Cancer Center is one of the organizers and long participants in NCCN. We rely on it. But if you have to go through the work of developing new treatments and then publishing, possibly the FDA review, hopefully, before it's widely used, although a lot of use occurs under off-label, of course. And then you have to go through the guidelines, and then in some opaque way, pathways are generated, which are trying to take account of the patient benefit, the predilections of providers, and of course, the premiums that the insurers have to live with until they can increase the premium to cover newly eligible services. So it's a very complex process with a lot of steps and a lot of delays from the point of view of the urgency, trying to bring innovative medicines to patients promptly.
Terrific, great perspective, thanks. And let me turn the same question to you, Kimberly. What is the most revealing component of our findings?
I think I'm going to answer what is the most important. There's two areas that I really want to focus on as important findings that stood out to me. One is related to transparency, and the second is related to accountability. Transparency, we've already heard a lot about throughout the webinar. It's critical that we have transparency at all three stages of the pathway process: the development stage, the implementation stage, and the evaluation stage. In particular, a couple things in the developmental phase. There's currently no universal best practices to guide the care pathway development. Our working group, of course, put together some recommendations for oncologic best practices, and both ASCO and NCCN have opined on best practices. But at this point, we don't have codified best practices to ensure that the underlying evidence that goes into the pathways is rigorous, that it's updated regularly enough to be picking up the rapid evolution of treatment knowledge that we have in the oncologic space. Also important for transparency in the development process is understanding the roles of the various stakeholders, the responsibilities, whether or not there's any conflict of interest. Those are all really important in the development stage. And just to underscore something that Trish already talked about, patient awareness is so critical. Generally, patients don't even know that they're on a pathway, and it's important that they know that their treatment plan may be following a pathway, whether the practice where they're receiving care is actually subject to any pathway-related incentives. And if they really want to get involved in it, they should have access to development information, impact of pathways on their care, all that sort of information that they might actually be very interested in. Then the second, to go back to the accountability, there are so many stakeholders that are involved in the process in various ways, and there's no single stakeholder group that is accountable for the whole process. One thing that Guy mentioned is that the developers view the monitoring and the evaluation as the payer or the provider role. Without having a single stakeholder group that's accountable for the whole process, we'll end up with gaps in oversight, and we won't actually know if pathways are meeting our goals, our objectives to deliver on the promise of improved patient outcomes. Those are the two areas that really stood out for me, accountability and transparency.
Great, thank you so much, Kimberly. And following up on that point of accountability that Kimberly just mentioned, Trish, let me turn it to you and ask, why is it so important that patients know what pathways are and how they are used to determine their care?
I think the best way I can answer that is to reflect on the findings of a national survey that we recently conducted of over 1,300 cancer patients. And the objective of this survey was really to understand patients' knowledge about pathways as well as their concerns and issues with pathways. The vast majority, meaning over 95% of those 1,300 patients, had never heard the term pathway. And even after it was defined, still approximately 95% said they were not familiar with this term. That's very disconcerting. Couple that with the fact that patients, by and large, trust their physicians to decide on and recommend the best treatment plan for them. So once we inform patients about pathways that may be directing their care, we ask them specifically what information they would want to know. The first and the largest concern was whether or not that pathway would prevent them from getting other or better treatment options later. They wanted to know what the medical evidence was that supported using the pathway. They wanted to know who was developing the pathway. They had quite grave concerns if it was being developed by a payer. They wanted to know what their out-of-pocket costs would be to them. They also wondered if their physician was getting any kind of a reward or benefit by following the pathway. And secondly, most important was what other treatment options might be available to me if they weren't followed on a pathway. And also, what were the prior outcomes for patients who were treated on a pathway? So they acknowledged that more than 95% of patients said that this information isn't currently being provided to them from either their physician, payer, or anyone else, but that they really needed their care team to fully explain the rationale and implications in the spirit of really having a voice in their treatment plan. So that summarizes why I think this is important.
Absolutely. Let's bring back in the provider perspective on that issue. So Dr. Oman, how can we leverage pathways to inform the patient-provider decision-making process, as Trish just laid out? Dr. Oman, if you're on mute.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I needed to be unmuted. Thank you. Well, this is a conundrum for physicians. In fact, I think our report is excellent and useful. The recommendations are sound. It's strongly supported by what Trish has just summarized from real data. You know, I've been wearing a button since February from the AAAS, the American Association for Advancement of Science, ask for the evidence. It applies to a lot of things. And it certainly applies here. And lay people, certainly highly motivated people like cancer patients, patients with cancers, are very keen to understand the basis of behind the information and recommendations they receive for their own care. They want to understand not just what it costs or it costs somebody else, but what's going to be the out-of-pocket consequence, and how do you take advantage of the pharmaceutical companies' various kinds of assistance, financial assistance programs. There are so many things to understand, but patient survivors who are advocates are extremely valuable participants in these sessions. We had two big programs at the April meeting of the AACR in Washington, one open to the whole public, the other for the registrants of the huge conference, highlighting panelists who were patient survivors. And they were brilliant in their sensitivity and their knowledge about the system in which care is delivered. This report does stumble a little trying to explain what pathways are. It's about pathways that differ from one vendor to another, from one payer to another. It drives us as crazy as physicians to have to try to sort these out and understand the withheld information that drives the details of different pathways. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, they start with guidelines, and our report sort of brushes that over, saying that guidelines and pathways have common goals, and it's to provide good advice for decision-making, clinical decision support. That's fine, but why do we have two different terms if they're really starting from the same evidence base and similar applications? Then we're told actually pathways are tools. This usually means algorithms for decision making, whether to cover, whether to pay, whether to inform, and it's a complicated message. Not too complicated for patients and their survivors and their advocates to really dig in on, but probably more complicated than most physicians want to dig on. So we struggle with this a little. We do have, however, a very nicely integrated program here at the University of Michigan, and I think many other academic medical centers and other cancer institutes around the country. We have a precision medicine tumor board, just as we've had tumor boards by type of cancers for many years. This is where we bring patients with their molecular data, family history, and various other parameters carefully identified to see if we can find a molecular lesion that defines that particular tumor and match it to an available drug or an available drug in an ongoing clinical trial. And of course, clinicaltrials.gov are used by patients and by all of us routinely to find out not just where are clinical trials underway, but which ones are still enrolling and which ones have any sites that they're enrolling anywhere near or convenient for a particular patient. This is a routine process now here, and the only caution is that it's not so often that we have a good match. If we have 15 patients under review in a session, we might find typically 2 for whom we can find such a match. And I'm a little anxious when I see slides and have presentations about how we've transformed oncology into a individualized precision medicine. First, most of it is not that precise yet, and it only applies to a subgroup of all the patients we want to help. But there is dramatic progress, and that's what's so exciting on both the provider side and the patient and family side. It brings us all together, trying to bring the most effective individual care in every case, as we've always claimed we were trying to do.
Right. Thank you very much. So, Kimberly, let me just turn it to you and continue on that that idea of matching treatments, the right treatments to patients. What role can pathways play in ensuring that patients have access to the cancer treatments, the new targeted cancer treatments, and all innovative treatments that can optimize outcomes for any subset or any individual patient?
Well, pathways can have an interesting role when it comes to personalized medicine. They can be used to really support it and help get the targeted treatments to the patients who need them, or they can be a barrier or a hindrance, and it really depends on how they're developed and how they're implemented. Pathways that are based on rigorous evidence and are updated regularly, they can actually inform personalized medicine and help drive value in oncologic care. Providers use pathways as a tool. They can be a great decision aid to provide the latest information in a rapidly evolving treatment space. They can help providers identify what's going to be the best treatment for this individual patient. And that individual patient has unique needs based on their cancer, the biology of their disease, the safety and the efficacy components that are the most important to them, and really what their personal treatment goals are. The way that pathways are developed really affects the extent to which they can actually support personalized medicine. If you've got these varying approaches, different degrees of methodological rigor, various levels of stakeholder involvement, may or may not include patients, pathways can really become difficult to assess and to adjust in order to meet individual patient needs. There's a couple of really positive things that we're seeing that are starting to happen. Diagnostics, such as biomarker testing, have been incorporated into pathways, and that helps tremendously in personalizing treatments. And care pathways are increasingly being used to improve clinical trial enrollment, which helps expand our knowledge base. Something that can hinder pathways supporting personalized medicine really has to do with the way that they're implemented. If physicians don't have the autonomy to make those treatment choices that they think are the best interest of the patient, if it's not easy for them to deviate from the pathway in cases where it's necessary, that can hinder personalized medicine. It's important that the incentives are not so rigid that it discourages appropriate pathway deviation. And it's important that the actual process for deviation isn't too onerous. We've talked a little bit about the prior authorization that can be required to go off a pathway and still get coverage from a payer. If that prior authorization is too onerous, as the provider collects the necessary evidence, it could result in delays in treatment, wasted resources, and it could just be easier to follow the pathway options instead of jumping through all of those hoops, and that may not be in the best interest of the patient. So it's really important that pathways are not limiting patient choice, that they're not a barrier to the treatment that is most appropriate for that patient, and that they're evidence-based and regularly updated in a way that informs personalized medicine and supports it.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Now I'm going to pull a slight audible looking at the time. We are running low on the hour, and I hope that our panelists can stay a little bit longer to take audience questions, but I'm probably aware that some of you will have to tune off. So let's move to audience questions immediately. Later, if time allows, I'll ask a following question, my final take-home question. But please, for the audience, if you have any questions, queue them up now and we'll get to them right away. Use that chat function for the GoToWebinar on the side. We will be pulling questions from there. So if you want to direct any of your questions to a specific speaker, please include their names. And if not, we'll try to tackle a question from whoever seems like the most appropriate person first, and get every perspective on it. But Courtney, let me turn it to you, see if you have any questions already queued up.
Thank you, Daryl. So we did get a couple of questions from people, some people who joined us late, but they were just wondering if you could, Daryl, maybe go back and provide or reiterate the definition of pathways.
So the definition of pathways that we had, and we don't have to go back in the slides, I'll just reiterate it. It's a treatment protocol for managing patient care based on clinical practice guidelines and other evidence, with the main goals of improving quality of care, reducing variation in clinical practice, and increasing the efficient use of healthcare resources. How's that?
Thank you, Daryl. And then a question, what are the implications of informing a patient about clinical pathways, if any? And Trish, maybe that would be one that you could discuss briefly, just kind of going through what does it mean to inform a patient, and maybe what happens if patients don't realize they're being treated on a pathway.
I'm not sure I would characterize it as implications. I would characterize it as an obligation, quite frankly. If there is something that a patient is unaware of that may be influencing or changing their treatment plan, I think a patient needs to know that. Our survey clearly showed that patients have absolute confidence in their doctor's ability to be able to prescribe or recommend the best treatment plan for them. If there is something that is changing that, a pathway, a payer standard, or an impediment to that, I do feel that the physician has an obligation to disclose that. And I think that it really needs to be a matter of policy from my perspective. So I don't think it's implication. I think it's an obligation. And I do apologize. I have another call that I must pop on, so I'm going to have to disconnect from the webinar. I do apologize.
Great, thank you. And one other question that I think would be interesting for the panelists and Daryl and Guy to weigh in on is, are there any cultural implications to the utilization of pathways?
So let me turn that to Dr. Oman and to Kimberly, who have studied this in great deal. And if Guy is still on the phone, if you could address that issue of cultural impediments to the use of the clinical pathways.
Well,
Yes.
why don't I start? It's Gil. Culture covers a lot of things about doctor-patient relationship, the ethnic differences and disparities in care. We start with a healthcare system in which there are huge disparities in understanding of healthcare, understanding of health status, certainly in access to care, and for health insurance status. And of course, this is being fought out in Washington right now. It's a little hard to get to subtleties of the most expensive or newest medicines when you have no health insurance and no doctor to start with. There are many, many big cultural problems here. There's a cultural problem also in the profession that guidelines and pathways have faced a lot of resistance, partly because they haven't always been well done, partly because there are competing guidelines or competing pathways, in this case from different insurers, but also because physicians, in some cases, reserve the sense of autonomy and reserve the sense of drawing their own conclusions from a small number of patients in whom they've had either good or bad results in their view, and are not familiar with or willing to rely on large data sets and statistical analyses, let alone applying a clinical parameter of the magnitude of benefit and the magnitude of risk, not just whether there's a statistical test that claims it was different from standard of care. We had a question earlier about big data. I happen to chair a newly merged organization called I2B2, developed at Harvard and used in dozens and dozens of places around the United States and Europe on big data from electronic medical records, together with the Transmart platform. It's been developed together with pharmaceutical industry and data science companies. The idea is to figure out what we can do when you have millions of patient lives and can look in depth at the parameters that affect patient response, adverse effects, and benefits. New York Times, just a few weeks ago, ran a front page story on the hottest topic in cancer therapy, which is immunotherapy, which people, including myself, are extremely excited about. But they pointed out correctly that some of the patients not only don't benefit, but have unexpected, maybe should be expected, autoimmune adverse responses, even fatal. So it's a lot of complexity, and events that occur at a low frequency cannot be judged so easily from an individual practice. This is a challenge of the culture of medical practice and utilization of appropriate data sets throughout the society as we try to do the best we can for patients and populations.
And Guy, let me just ask you to follow up on that. Is there any indication that as these the clinical pathways developers are developing different pathways, that they're considering use in vastly different populations? So, you know, one of the questions I think that's implied by the audience question is the cultural aspects. If you're taking a clinical pathway that was developed for one population and then try to apply it in a totally different population where there's a different racial, ethnic, age, demographic, how do they account for that? And are the clinical developers thinking about those types of questions?
Yeah. So in our research, we didn't explore that question specifically. It's my impression from the research that the pathway developers are not focused on that level of nuance in terms of patient experience and how different patients might experience being on a pathway. I think the issue probably comes up more in the implementation of pathways and the flexibility that a health plan might offer to a physician or to a care team in deviating from the pathway when it is aligned with the patient's needs and preferences. So recognizing that, you know, there will be unique patients who have unique preferences or needs, most health plans do allow some flexibility to deviate from the pathway, but that is highly contextual to the specific health plan. Those rules vary, and that's why it's important to think about both the pathway content itself and the implementation when we think about the overall way that pathways shape patient care delivery and outcomes.
Courtney, do you want to move on to another question?
So I think that wraps up the audience questions that we have. Daryl, if you want to, I can move forward to the next slide.
Okay, well, thanks again to all, but before we close, I do want to notify everyone about our upcoming Turning the Tide National Conference, which will be taking place in Washington, D.C. at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center on Thursday, June 29th. The theme of this year's conference will be to explore the role of the patient across the continuum of cancer research and care. It'll be a solutions-oriented discussion aimed at finding strategies for the stakeholder community to support meaningful patient engagement and to deliver value to patients. So the clinical pathways component is part of this. We have a great lineup of speakers, including a luncheon keynote address to be delivered by Joan London. You can view the agenda and register for the conference at the Turning the Tide website, which is listed on this slide. And we look forward to seeing you all there. So with that, I do want to end the webinar, and I want to thank everybody for taking a little time extra to participate. Certainly, I'd like to thank Guy, Trish, Dr. Oman, and Kimberly for their participation. An excellent presentation by Guy and an excellent presentation by our panelists. And especially thank you to everyone who joined us today from across the country. We got terrific registration and participation in the webinar, which really indicates that this issue is of utmost importance and interest to the community. So we appreciate your tuning in and all of your time. So let me turn it back over to Courtney to adjourn.
Thank you, Daryl. And again, thank you to all of our panelists and, of course, all of our audience members. If you want more information on the Turning the Tide initiative, please visit us at www.turningthetideagainstcancer.org. Also find us on Twitter at T3Cancer. And definitely, if you have any other questions, please feel free to email either Daryl Pritchard or the Turning the Tide staff. Our emails are on this slide. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day.